The sound of shattering glass echoed through the small wooden house as Delilah Armstrong ducked behind the dining table, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild Mustang trying to break free. Blood trickled down her temple where her husband's whiskey bottle had grazed her moments before. She'd endured 3 years of Frank's drunken rages, but tonight something inside her had finally broken, just like the countless bottles he'd hurled at the walls. "You worthless woman," Frank bellowed, his words slurred as he staggered across the room. "Get back here." Delilah's fingers trembled as she clutched the small bag she'd packed in secret over the past week, a few clothes, her mother's locket, and the meager savings she'd hidden away from Frank's drinking money. The Montana Territory of 1876 offered few options for a woman alone, but death by her husband's hands wasn't something she was willing to accept. When Frank lurched toward the kitchen for another bottle, Delilah seized her chance. She bolted for the door, the cool night air hitting her face as she ran into the darkness. Behind her, Frank's angry shouts grew more distant as she fled toward the dense woods that bordered their property. Her lungs burned and her legs ached, but she pushed forward, knowing that stopping meant death or worse, returning to the hell she'd endured for too long. The moon cast eerie shadows through the trees as Delilah made her way eastward. She'd heard of a town called Redemption Creek, some 20 miles away. Perhaps there she could find passage on a stagecoach heading farther east, maybe all the way to St. Louis where her cousin lived. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all she had left. By dawn, Delilah had covered nearly 10 miles, her dress torn from branches and her boots caked with mud. She paused at a small creek to drink and splash water on her bruised face. The reflection that stared back at her was almost unrecognizable, a hollow-eyed woman of 23 with a swollen lip and a purpling bruise across her cheekbone. She touched the wedding band on her finger, then yanked it off and hurled it into the flowing water. Whatever happened next, she would no longer be Frank Armstrong's wife to beat. As the morning sun climbed higher, Delilah stayed off the main trails, moving through the woods when possible. Frank would surely come looking for her once he sobered up enough to saddle his horse. He'd always told her what he'd do if she ever tried to leave, threats that made her shudder even now. By midday, the rolling hills gave way to more open country, and Delilah realized she'd have to risk exposure to make progress. Her stomach growled painfully, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since yesterday's noon meal. In her bag, she had only a small piece of bread she'd managed to grab before fleeing. The distant sound of hoofbeats sent her diving behind a large boulder. Her heart hammered as she peered around the edge, expecting to see Frank's dappled gray horse appearing over the rise. Instead, a lone rider on a chestnut mare came into view, a stranger. She pressed herself against the rock, praying he wouldn't spot her. The rider slowed as he approached the stream nearby. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. A rifle was secured to his saddle, and a revolver hung at his hip, not unusual for these parts, but enough to make Delilah's blood run cold. Men with guns had never meant safety in her experience. She watched as he dismounted and led his horse to drink. He seemed to be in no hurry, surveying the landscape with a careful eye. When he turned in her direction, Delilah ducked down, but her movement dislodged a small stone that clattered down the slope. The man's hand immediately moved to his revolver. "Who's there?" His voice was deep but not menacing. "Show yourself." Delilah remained frozen, weighing her options. Running would surely get her shot, but revealing herself to an armed stranger carried its own risks. "I'm not looking for trouble," the man called out, "but I won't hesitate to defend myself if needed." Taking a deep breath, Delilah slowly stood up, her hands raised. "Please," she said, her voice cracking, "I mean no harm." The man's expression shifted from wariness to concern as he took in her battered appearance. He immediately removed his hand from his gun. "Madam, are you all right?" he asked, taking a cautious step forward. "Stay back," Delilah warned, her entire body trembling. The man stopped, then carefully set his revolver on a nearby rock, barrel pointing away from her. "My name is Jake O'Malley. I'm just passing through these parts. Looks like you could use some help." Delilah stared at the discarded weapon, then at the man Jake. His face was weathered from the sun, but not hardened by cruelty like Frank's. His eyes were a clear blue that reminded her of the summer sky. "I don't need help," she lied, even as she swayed slightly from hunger and exhaustion. Jake noticed her unsteadiness. "When's the last time you ate, madam?" She didn't answer, but her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl. "I've got some jerky and hardtack in my saddlebag, nothing fancy, but it'll keep you going." He moved slowly toward his horse, keeping his distance from both Delilah and his discarded gun. "I'm not going to hurt you." After a moment's hesitation, hunger won out over fear. Delilah approached cautiously as Jake retrieved a small bundle from his saddlebag. He unwrapped it and offered her some dried beef and a biscuit. "Thank you," she murmured, taking the food with shaking hands and devouring it faster than was polite. Jake didn't comment on her manners, just handed her his canteen. "Where you headed?" he asked casually. Delilah swallowed hard. "Redemption Creek." "That's a fair piece from here," Jake observed, "especially on foot." "I'll manage," she replied, handing back his canteen. Jake studied her for a moment. "Those bruises, someone do that to you?" Delilah instinctively touched her face, then looked away. "It's not your concern, Mr. O'Malley." "Jake," he corrected gently. "And maybe not, but I was raised to believe a man who raises his hand to a woman is no man at all." His words brought unexpected tears to Delilah's eyes, which she quickly blinked away. She'd cried enough tears over Frank Armstrong. "He'll be looking for me," she admitted finally. "My husband, I ran last night." Jake's expression darkened. "He did that to your face," Delilah nodded, "and worse many times before, but I'm done with it now." "You got folks in Redemption Creek?" "No, I was hoping to catch a stage east from there." Jake considered this, then glanced at the sun. "It'll be dark in a few hours. You won't make it to town tonight, and these woods aren't safe for a woman alone after dark." "I'm aware of the dangers, Mr. Jake," Delilah replied stiffly. "But they pale in comparison to what awaits me if I go back." "I didn't suggest going back," Jake said. "I'm headed to Redemption Creek myself. I can get you there by tomorrow noon if you're willing to ride double." Delilah eyed him suspiciously. "Why would you help me?" Jake's gaze was steady. "Because it's the right thing to do. And what do you want in return?" Her bitter experience with men had taught her that nothing came without a price. Something like sadness flickered across Jake's face. "Not all men are like your husband, madam." Delilah weighed her options. Jake seemed decent enough, and the alternative was spending another night in the wilderness with Frank, possibly on her trail. She nodded slowly. "Very well, but I'll ride behind you, and if you try anything, I have a knife in my boot." Jake's mouth quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Fair enough." He picked up his gun and holstered it, then extended his hand to help her onto the horse. "May I have your name, madam?" "Delilah," she said after a moment's hesitation. "Delilah Armstrong." They rode in silence for the next few hours. Delilah perched uncomfortably behind Jake, maintaining as much distance as the saddle would allow. Despite her wariness, the rhythmic movement of the horse and the warmth of the sun soon had her nodding off, her body finally succumbing to exhaustion. She woke with a start as her head bumped against Jake's back. Horrified, she straightened immediately. "You can lean on me if you need to rest, Mrs. Armstrong," Jake said without turning around. "I promise I won't take it as anything more than what it is." "I'm fine," Delilah insisted, though her eyelids felt like lead weights. As dusk approached, Jake guided the horse off the trail into a sheltered clearing. "We'll camp here for the night," he announced, dismounting and then offering his hand to help Delilah down. She ignored his outstretched hand and slid off the horse herself, wincing as her stiff legs hit the ground. Jake didn't comment on her rejection. Instead, he busied himself unsaddling the horse and gathering wood for a small fire. Delilah stood awkwardly to the side, unsure of her role in this temporary alliance. "There's a small creek just over that rise if you want to freshen up," Jake said, nodding toward a gentle slope. "I'll get the fire going." Grateful for the opportunity to be alone, Delilah made her way to the creek. The cool water was soothing on her face, and she took the opportunity to wash away the dirt and dried blood from her journey. Her reflection in the water showed that the swelling around her eye had gone down somewhat, but the bruise had darkened to a deep purple. When she returned to the campsite, Jake had a small fire crackling and was preparing a simple meal of beans and more jerky. He didn't look up as she approached, giving her the space she clearly needed. "You a bounty hunter?" Delilah asked suddenly, noticing the wanted poster sticking out of his saddlebag. Jake glanced up, then shook his head. "Former marshal." I track down fugitives sometimes when local law can't handle it, but only the ones who truly deserve it. And who decides who deserves it? The law, mostly, Jake replied, stirring the beans. But sometimes a man has to listen to his own conscience. Delilah sat down across the fire from him. Who are you after now? Jake hesitated, then pulled out the poster. Man named William Slater killed 2 people during a bank robbery in Helena. Word is he's hiding out near Redemption Creek. Delilah studied the crude drawing on the poster. He looks dangerous. Most desperate men are, Jake said quietly, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. They ate in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. After the meal, Jake offered Delilah his bedroll. What about you? She asked. I'll be fine with my saddle and blanket, he assured her. I've slept on worse. Delilah hesitated, then accepted the bedroll, arranging it on the opposite side of the fire from where Jake had placed his saddle. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she lay watching the stars appear one by one in the vast Montana sky. He'll never stop looking for me, you know, she said softly, unsure if Jake was still awake. Some men don't know how to let go, came his reply from across the fire, but that doesn't mean you have to stay caught. Is that what happened to your wife? Delilah asked, noticing for the first time the worn spot on his finger where a ring might once have been. The silence stretched so long that Delilah thought Jake might not answer. Finally, his voice came through the darkness, tinged with old pain. Catherine died in childbirth 5 years ago. Along with our son. I'm sorry, Delilah whispered, immediately regretting her question. It was a long time ago, Jake said, though his tone suggested the wound was still fresh. Get some sleep, Mrs. Armstrong. We've got an early start tomorrow. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Delilah awoke to find Jake already up, tending to his horse and preparing a small breakfast of coffee and the last of his hardtack. They ate quickly and were on the trail before the sun had fully risen. We should reach Redemption Creek by midday, Jake informed her as they rode. There's a stage that comes through every Thursday headed for Billings, and from there you can connect to the eastern routes. Delilah nodded, grateful for the information but increasingly unsure about her plans. The little money she had would barely cover a stage ticket, let alone sustain her until she could find work or reach her cousin. What will you do once you're east? Jake asked, as if reading her thoughts. I have a cousin in St. Louis, she replied, though I haven't seen her in years. I'm not sure she'll welcome me, but she's all the family I have left. And if she doesn't, Delilah straightened her shoulders, then I'll find work. I can sew, cook, clean. I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. O'Malley. I don't doubt that, Jake said. It takes courage to leave everything behind and start over. His words warmed something inside Delilah that had been cold for a very long time. As they crested a hill around midday, the small settlement of Redemption Creek came into view. It wasn't much a main street with a general store, saloon, small church, and a handful of other buildings, but to Delilah, it represented hope. Jake guided his horse toward the livery stable at the edge of town. As they dismounted, Delilah noticed him scanning the street with the practiced eye of a lawman. The stage office is just down the street, he said, gesturing to a small building with a weathered sign. I need to speak with the sheriff, but I can walk you there first. That won't be necessary, Delilah insisted, clutching her small bag. You've done more than enough, Jake. Thank you. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills. Take this, he said, holding out the money. It's not much, but it might help until you get settled. Delilah shook her head firmly. I can't accept that. Consider it payment for the pleasure of your company on the trail, Jake said with a slight smile. When she still hesitated, he added more seriously, please. Catherine would have wanted to help you. At the mention of his late wife, Delilah reluctantly accepted the money. I'll pay you back someday. No need, Jake said. Just promise you'll be careful. Their eyes met for a long moment. Delilah felt a strange reluctance to part ways with this quiet, honorable man who had shown her more kindness in one day than Frank had in 3 years of marriage. Good luck with your fugitive, she said finally, turning to go. Delilah, Jake called after her. She paused and looked back. If things don't work out with the stage, the hotel has a restaurant that might be hiring. Ask for Mrs. Whitaker. Tell her I sent you. Delilah nodded, touched by his continued concern. Goodbye, Jake O'Malley. As she walked toward the stage office, Delilah felt Jake's eyes following her. It was different from the possessive stare Frank often fixed on her. This felt protective, concerned. She forced herself not to look back. The news at the stage office was disappointing but not unexpected. The next stage wouldn't arrive for 3 days, and the fare to Billings would take nearly all the money she had, even with Jake's contribution. With a sigh, Delilah made her way to the small hotel Jake had mentioned. Mrs. Whitaker, a plump, no-nonsense woman in her 50s, looked Delilah up and down with shrewd eyes when she inquired about work. "Jake O'Malley sent you, did he?" Mrs. Whitaker asked, her gaze lingering on Delilah's fading bruises. "Yes, madam, we met on the trail." Delilah kept her explanation vague. Mrs. Whitaker nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if Jake vouches for you, that's good enough for me. I could use help in the kitchen and with the rooms. Pays not much, but you'll get meals and a place to sleep in the back room." Relief flooded through Delilah. "Thank you, I can start right away." "Good. First thing you can do is get yourself cleaned up. Can't have you serving customers looking like you've been dragged through a briar patch." Mrs. Whitaker's tone was gruff, but not unkind as she showed Delilah to a small room behind the kitchen. For the next 2 days, Delilah worked harder than she ever had, rising before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the hotel guests and working until late evening cleaning rooms and washing dishes. The work was exhausting but honest, and Mrs. Whitaker was a fair employer who asked no questions about Delilah's past. On her 3rd day in Redemption Creek, as Delilah was sweeping the hotel's front porch, she spotted Jake O'Malley emerging from the sheriff's office across the street. He looked tired, with several days' growth of beard shadowing his jaw, but his steps were purposeful as he crossed to the hotel. He stopped at the foot of the steps, removing his hat. "Mrs. Armstrong, I see you found Mrs. Whitaker." "I did, thanks to you," Delilah replied, suddenly conscious of her work-worn appearance. "She's been very kind," Jake nodded. "She's a good woman, lost her husband in the war, raised 3 boys on her own. She understands hardship." A moment of awkward silence stretched between them. "Any luck with your fugitive?" Delilah finally asked. Jake shook his head. "Slater's been spotted north of here, but the trail's gone cold. I'll be heading out tomorrow to keep looking." "Oh," Delilah said, surprised by her disappointment. "Well, I wish you success." Jake studied her face. "The bruises are fading." Delilah touched her cheek self-consciously. "Yes, soon they'll be gone completely." "And the stage, will you still be leaving?" "I've decided to stay a while," Delilah admitted. "Save up a bit more before heading east, Mrs. Whitaker says I can have permanent work if I want it." Something like pleasure flickered in Jake's eyes. "That's good news." Before either could say more, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. 3 riders were coming down the main street, and even from a distance, Delilah recognized the lead rider's dappled gray horse. Her blood turned to ice. "It's Frank," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "My husband." Jake's expression hardened as he turned to look at the approaching men. Without a word, he moved to stand in front of Delilah, shielding her from view. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Go through the back and find Sheriff Davis. Tell him what's happening." Delilah hesitated, torn between fear and concern for Jake. "Frank's dangerous when he's drinking, and he rarely stops these days." "I've dealt with men like him before," Jake assured her. "Go now, Delilah." The use of her first name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest despite her fear. With one last glance at Jake's broad shoulders standing firm between her and danger, Delilah slipped inside the hotel. She didn't go to the sheriff. Instead, she watched through the window as Frank and his companions, 2 rough-looking men she recognized from the saloon near their homestead, reined in their horses in front of the hotel. Frank dismounted unsteadily, confirming Delilah's suspicion that he'd been drinking. "I'm looking for my wife," Frank announced loudly, his words slightly slurred. "Red-haired woman about so high, ran off a few days back." "Can't say I've seen anyone fitting that description," Jake replied evenly, his stance relaxed but alert. "Perhaps you should check the next town over." Frank's eyes narrowed as he took in Jake's appearance. "Who the hell are you?" "Just a traveler passing through," Jake said, his hand casually resting near his holstered gun. "Though I have to wonder what kind of man has to track down his wife with armed companions." Frank's face darkened with anger. "My wife's whereabouts are my business, mister. I suggest you step aside before you get hurt. I suggest you mount up and ride out of town." Jake countered, his voice taking on a steely edge that Delilah hadn't heard before. Whatever quarrel you have with your wife, it's clear she doesn't want to be found. Frank's hand moved toward his gun, but Jake was faster. In one fluid motion, he drew his revolver and aimed it squarely at Frank's chest. I wouldn't, he warned. Frank froze, his bloodshot eyes widening. His companions shifted nervously on their horses. Now, I'm going to say this once, Jake continued, his voice deadly calm. Turn around, get on your horse, and leave this town. If your wife wanted to be with you, she wouldn't have run in the first place. You don't know anything about it, Frank snarled. She's my property by law. No woman is property, Jake replied, and any man who thinks otherwise doesn't deserve to call himself a husband. For a tense moment, Delilah thought Frank might draw despite Jake's warning. Then one of his companions called out, Come on, Frank, she ain't worth dying over. Frank's face contorted with rage, but after a moment he spat on the ground at Jake's feet. Keep the whore, he growled. She was never good for much anyway. Jake's expression didn't change, but his finger tightened slightly on the trigger. Get out of my sight before I forget I'm a civilized man. Something in Jake's tone must have convinced Frank of his danger. He backed up slowly, then mounted his horse with clumsy movements. This isn't over, he warned, but there was fear behind his bravado now. Yes, Jake said simply, it is. The three men wheeled their horses around and galloped out of town, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Only when they were out of sight did Jake lower his gun and turn toward the hotel. His eyes met Delilah's through the window, and the intensity of his gaze took her breath away. She opened the door with trembling hands as Jake climbed the steps. You didn't go to the sheriff, he observed, holstering his weapon. No, Delilah admitted. I couldn't leave you to face him alone. Jake's expression softened. That was brave, foolish but brave. Thank you, Delilah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. No one has ever stood up for me like that. Jake reached out hesitantly as if to touch her face, then let his hand fall back to his side. Frank won't be back anytime soon, but he made threats. I don't like leaving you here unprotected. I'll be fine, Delilah insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Whitaker's sons visit often, and the sheriff, come with me, Jake interrupted, the words seeming to surprise him as much as they did her. Delilah stared at him in confusion. With you to hunt your fugitive, Jake shook his head. No, not for that. I have a small ranch about a day's ride from here, nothing fancy but it's peaceful. You could stay there, at least until we're sure Frank isn't coming back. Why would you do that for me? Delilah asked, searching his face. Jake was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Because when I look at you, I see someone who deserves a chance at happiness, someone brave enough to start over despite the risks. And maybe. He paused, looking away briefly before meeting her eyes again. Maybe because for the first time in 5 years, I've thought about something other than the past. The simple honesty in his words moved Delilah deeply. She thought of the lonely days she'd spent in her marriage to Frank, the nights filled with fear, the dreams of freedom she'd nearly abandoned. And then she thought of Jake, his quiet strength, his honor, the way he'd set down his gun rather than frighten her when they first met. I don't know what kind of future I'm looking for, she said softly. I'm not asking for promises, Jake replied, just offering a safe place while you figure it out. Delilah took a deep breath. I'll need to speak with Mrs. Whitaker. Jake's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds after a storm. Of course. The next morning found them riding out of Redemption Creek, Delilah perched on a newly purchased mare beside Jake. Mrs. Whitaker had been surprisingly understanding, even insisting that Delilah could return to her position whenever she wished. As they crested the same hill where they'd first viewed the town together, Jake reined in his horse and turned to Delilah. Last chance to change your mind, he said, his expression serious. I won't think less of you if you decide to stay in town. Delilah looked back at the small settlement, then toward the open country beyond. The future stretched before her, uncertain but full of possibilities she'd never dared imagine during her years with Frank. I'm not changing my mind, she said firmly, meeting Jake's gaze. Lead the way, Mr. O'Malley. Jake's answering smile was warm enough to chase away the morning chill. As they rode side by side toward the distant mountains, Delilah felt something unfurling in her chest, something that felt remarkably like hope. Jake's ranch was indeed small, but well kept, a sturdy cabin nestled in a valley with a creek running nearby, a barn, corral, and enough grazing land for his small herd of cattle. It was simple, honest, and beautiful in a way that spoke to Delilah's soul. "It's not much," Jake said as they dismounted in the yard, "but it's home." "It's lovely," Delilah replied sincerely, taking in the wildflowers that grew along the path to the cabin door. The interior was neat but sparse, clearly the home of a man who lived alone. There were touches, though, that suggested a woman's hand in the past: curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed in the small bedroom. "Catherine's things," Jake explained, following her gaze. "I couldn't bring myself to put them away." "I understand," Delilah said softly. "You don't need to change anything on my account. I'll be comfortable on a pallet by the fire." Jake showed her around the property, introduced her to his small herd of cattle and the 2 horses in the corral beside his own. By evening, they had settled into a surprisingly comfortable routine, with Delilah cooking a simple meal from Jake's provisions while he tended to the animals. As they sat at his small table eating supper, Jake asked, "Will you tell me about yourself? Before Frank, I mean." Delilah hesitated, then nodded. "There isn't much to tell. My father was a shopkeeper in a small town in Iowa. When he died, there wasn't much left after the debts were paid. I had no skills except helping in the shop, so when Frank came along offering marriage and a new life out west, it seemed like providence." She gave a bitter laugh. "My mother warned me about marrying a man who smelled of whiskey before noon, but I was young and thought I knew better." "We all make mistakes when we're young," Jake said without judgment. "What about you?" Delilah asked. "How did you end up here?" Jake leaned back in his chair. "I came west after the war, served with the Union Army, then worked as a marshal in Kansas for a few years. Met Catherine there. She was a school teacher. We married and decided to start fresh somewhere quieter. Bought this place 7 years ago. You must miss her very much," Delilah said gently. Jake's eyes grew distant. "Every day, but lately it's different. The pain is still there, but it's not as sharp. I think she'd be glad of that." The days stretched into weeks, and Delilah found herself settling into life at the ranch with unexpected ease. She tended the small kitchen garden, cooked meals, and even learned to help with some of the ranch work. Jake was a patient teacher, never making her feel inadequate when she struggled with new tasks. They developed a companionable routine, sharing meals and conversation, working side by side during the day, and sitting on the porch in the evenings watching the sunset. Jake never pushed for more than friendship, and Delilah was grateful for his restraint as she continued to heal from the wounds of her marriage. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Jake cleared his throat. "Sheriff Davis sent word that Frank was arrested in Helena for starting a brawl in a saloon. He'll be locked up for at least a month." Relief washed over Delilah. "That's good news. It means you could safely return to Redemption Creek if you wanted," Jake continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Mrs. Whitaker would still welcome your help." Delilah studied his profile in the fading light. "Are you asking me to leave, Jake?" "No," he said quickly, turning to meet her eyes. "God knows, no, but I don't want you to feel obligated to stay because of Frank or because of what I did." "Is that what you think?" Delilah asked softly. "That I'm here out of obligation," Jake looked away. "I know I'm not much compared to what you could find elsewhere, an aging ex-marshal with a small ranch and too many memories." Delilah reached out and took his hand, surprising them both with her boldness. "Do you know what I see when I look at you, Jake O'Malley? I see a man of honor, a man who set down his gun and offered help to a frightened woman with no thought of reward. I see someone who makes me feel safe for the first time in years." Jake's fingers tightened around hers. "Delilah. I'm not staying out of obligation," she continued, her heart pounding. "I'm staying because for the first time since I can remember, I'm happy." The look in Jake's eyes made her breath catch. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle and questioning, nothing like Frank's demanding, whiskey-soaked kisses. When they parted, Jake rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he whispered. "Neither did I," Delilah admitted. The following morning, as Delilah was gathering eggs from the small chicken coop Jake maintained, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Fear spiked through her. Had Frank somehow been released early? But Jake's calm demeanor as he walked from the barn reassured her. "Sheriff Davis," Jake called in greeting as two riders came into view. "What brings you out this way?" The sheriff, a weathered man with a salt and pepper mustache, dismounted stiffly. "News, Jake. William Slater was captured near the Canadian border. Thought you'd want to know since you put so much time into tracking him." "Good to hear," Jake replied. Justice served then. The sheriff's companion, a younger deputy, was eyeing Delilah curiously. Feeling self-conscious, she approached with the basket of eggs. "Mrs. Armstrong," the sheriff acknowledged with a tip of his hat. "You're looking well." "Thank you, Sheriff," Delilah replied, moving to stand beside Jake. The sheriff's eyes moved between them, a knowing look crossing his face. "Well, we should be getting back to town. Just wanted to deliver the news personally." As the lawman prepared to leave, the sheriff pulled Jake aside briefly. Delilah couldn't hear their conversation, but Jake returned looking thoughtful. "What did he say?" she asked once they were alone. "He brought divorce papers," Jake said quietly. "Said a woman in your situation has grounds, especially with Frank's recent arrest. If you wanted to file, he'd make sure it went through with minimal trouble." Delilah's heart raced. "Divorce, is that even possible?" "It's rare, but not unheard of in cases of abandonment or cruelty," Jake explained. "Davis said he'd testify to Frank's threats in town if needed." The possibility of being truly free of Frank left Delilah momentarily speechless. She'd assumed she would always be tied to him legally, even if she lived apart. "You don't have to decide anything now," Jake assured her, misinterpreting her silence. "It's just an option." Delilah looked up at him, her decision already made. "I want to file, I want to be free of him completely." Jake's smile was radiant. "Then we'll ride into town tomorrow." That night, as they sat by the fire after supper, a comfortable silence settled between them. Delilah found herself watching Jake as he repaired a piece of tack, his strong hands working the leather with practiced ease. He must have felt her gaze, for he looked up, his eyes questioning. "What happens after?" she asked softly. "After what? After the divorce, after I'm free?" Jake set aside his work and turned to face her fully. "That depends on what you want, Delilah. You'll have choices then that you don't have now. And if what I want is to stay here, with you," the hope that bloomed in Jake's eyes was unmistakable, "then nothing would make me happier, but I need you to be sure. I don't want to be just a safe harbor for you to shelter in during a storm." Delilah moved from her chair to kneel beside him, taking his hands in hers. "You're far more than that, Jake O'Malley. When I ran from Frank, I was just trying to survive. I never expected to find someone who would teach me what love could actually be." "Love?" Jake repeated, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes," Delilah affirmed, the word both frightening and freeing. "I love you, not because you saved me, but because of who you are, because you're kind and honorable and patient, because you make me feel like I matter." Jake pulled her gently into his arms. "You matter more than anything to me, Delilah. I love you too. Have since that day by the creek when you told me you had a knife in your boot." Delilah laughed through sudden tears. "I didn't actually have a knife." Jake chuckled, stroking her hair. "I figured as much. Brave bluff, though." 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Delilah stood before the small church in Redemption Creek, wearing a new blue dress that Mrs. Whittaker had helped her sew. Her divorce from Frank had been finalized 3 months prior, with surprisingly little difficulty once the judge heard testimony about her husband's cruelty. Frank himself never appeared to contest it. Rumor had it he'd headed to California after his release from jail, apparently deciding that pursuing Delilah wasn't worth the trouble after all. Now, as Delilah exchanged vows with Jake before the town's minister, she felt as though her life had truly begun anew. Jake's eyes never left hers as he promised to love, honor, and cherish her for all his days, his voice steady and sure. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jake kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. As they turned to face the small gathering of well-wishers, Mrs. Whittaker, Sheriff Davis, neighbors from surrounding ranches, Delilah felt a sense of belonging she'd never known before. "Mrs. O'Malley," Jake murmured as they walked back down the aisle. "How does it sound?" "Perfect," Delilah replied, squeezing his hand. "Absolutely perfect." As they rode back to the ranch that evening, their ranch now, the setting sun painted the Montana sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. Jake reined in his horse on the ridge overlooking their home, and Delilah stopped beside him. "Happy?" he asked, reaching across to take her hand. Delilah looked at the simple cabin nestled in the valley below, smoke curling from the chimney where Mrs. Whittaker's eldest son had built up the fire before their return. She thought of the future stretching before them, seasons changing, a family perhaps, years of working side by side with this good man who had shown her what love truly meant. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she answered truthfully. "You offered your heart when I had nothing to give in return." "You gave me everything, Delilah," Jake said softly. "You gave me a reason to live again instead of just existing." As they rode down toward home, their home, Delilah realized that in running from Frank, she hadn't just escaped a cruel husband. She had run toward a life she'd never dared to imagine, toward a love that healed rather than hurt, toward a future bright with promise. And Jake, the quiet cowboy who had set down his gun and offered his heart to a frightened woman on the run, had found that in saving her, he had also saved himself.